Hello, this is old Mr. Kent of MrKent.com, and one more time my plans were changed and I had a fully charged battery for my Mavic Air 2, and so I thought, well, I need to get that discharge. So this is another discharge flight, and I thought I'll just get up early in the morning and go get a shot of the sunrise here in Arizona. Only problem is I forgot to take the ND filter off of the lens. So it's kind of an ugly video. But I thought, okay, well, I'll just take this opportunity to throw another story your way. Since it's dark, I'll tell you a story about flying my full-size plane in the dark. And by the way, here's a couple of shots of my Cessna 170 that I had. I was blessed. I was working at a boarding school near Othello, Washington, and it was up on a hill called Radar Hill because during the Cold War, they had a couple of radar domes up there. And then out in the desert surrounding it, there was a whole bunch of missile silos, which had been since filled up with sand. So while I was working there, I was able to make my own airstrip. And so there's that picture. There's the plane sitting where I had it tied down, and the owl on the cowling is because I needed to keep the birds away because they went in and they like to go in and make nests on top of the cylinders. Well, and then the other picture is when I was actually taken off downhill off of my little airstrip. So anyway, back when I had that plane, I don't remember, I was living in Pasco at the time, before I worked at the boarding school. Now then, there is a sunrise, if you can see it. If you just watch for a second there, you'll see a sunrise. It's just starting to peek through the clouds just a little off center there, and it'll get brighter and brighter. But anyway, I lived in Pasco, which is in southeastern Washington, and I needed to go see my folks, and I don't remember why at this point in time, but eastern Washington is a desert type country, and my folks lived near Enumclaw, which is where a little airstrip was. And so I flew over to see my folks, and I don't know why, I can't remember now, but I also took my two children, my son and my daughter, and they were like 7, 8 years old or something like that. Now the airstrip at the Enumclaw airstrip, it acts basically an old farm that was sold, and then somebody bought the property, and there's other houses built around it, but they put in a little airstrip. And it's everything is grass, and the airstrip isn't very long, and it looks to me like it was an old road, and so it was level up and down the strip, but it was also not. It was like that. It had a drainage ditch along the side, and so it was sloped a little bit. So it was exciting to land and take off. And the parking area was not level. And there were no tie downs. So you just found a nice place to sit the plane. And then one of the things you had to do, because one of the times I went over there, you have the fuel tanks are in the wings of a Cessna 170, and then you have a valve that switches between the right wing and the left wing, or it can be on both. And normally I would fly on both tanks. But when you park at a place where the wings aren't level, then the upper the fuel in the upper wing drains through the shutoff valve and goes into the lower wing, and then finally when you come back to the airport, you get gas all over the ground from that. So what you wanted to do was to flip either to the right wing or the left wing, and that blocked that flow through. If you can understand. So anyway, in western Washington, the air comes in off the ocean, and as it hits the Cascade Mountains, which is where Enumclaw is kind of tucked into the west side of the Cascade Mountains, and where it hits those mountains, it rises, and as it rises, it drops all the air that came in, or all the moisture that came in off the ocean. So generally the west side of the Cascades in that area is cloudy and wet, and that's where Seattle gets its reputation of having 6 months of rain and 6 months of when it drips off of the trees. Well, anyway, so when it came time to go home, it had clouded over, and there was no way I could take off because I had to fly VFR, Visual Flight Rules. And so a day went by, and it never cleared up. And then I think maybe on the next day, that afternoon, it was bad. And so that evening, we went to visit some friends. And as we were driving back, about 10 o'clock in the evening, I looked out the car window where I was sitting, and I could see stars. And so I thought, let's hurry home. Let's get everything and pack it up in the plane, and let's take off, because as long as I can see stars, it's a clear sky. So we hurried with my folks, and we grabbed everything, and we hurried back to the strip, and I wrapped my kids up in their sleeping bags in the back seat, and jumped in the plane, and started the motor, taxied down that old airstrip, turned around, took off, and I had to head east, and so I took off, and we got out of the airport fine. And there's a term in pilot language called get-home-itis. Get-home-itis is where you do everything you can to get home, whether you die or not. And there's been a lot of pilots kill themselves and their families because they thought, oh, I have to hurry home. Well, the reason I took off was because the weather in Pasco on the east side of the mountains, it was clear. It had been clear all day, and it was going to be clear all night. But the Cascades were overcast up to about 10,000 feet. So I took off, and I knew I could fly over the mountains, and when I got to the other side, I'd have clear weather, and I could land. And so I made a slow circling climb of about, I think it was about 400 feet or something like that, 700 feet, up to 10,000 feet. And I remember as I was circling around, I looked down to where I had taken off, and slowly the clouds were covering up those lights again. And so it was totally, as I came around again, I could see that it was totally covered with clouds, and I couldn't see where I had taken off, so I was like, there's no return. I'm on my way to Pasco no matter what. And I watched, as I was circling several times, I watched the jetliners taking off and landing from the SeaTac airport, and finally I got up to my altitude, which was somewhere around 10,500 feet or so, and started heading east over the mountains. And I had to go due east because there's a MOA, military operation area, that I had to be sure and fly around, because you don't fly over that. You'd love to get hit by a plane. Anyway, so it was kind of I got started. It was kind of just a boring flight, but as I got over the clouds over the mountains, there were no lights below. I couldn't see anything, and there was enough moonlight that I could kind of see the clouds as I was flying over. And the funny thing is after you've been, and it was a 2-hour flight, so after you've been flying for a while over the mountains, pretty soon you begin to realize, I've never heard that sound in the engine before. And then you begin to kind of panic. And I mean, it's real. I could tell you some panic stories, but I don't have time in this one. Anyway, so you begin to think, oh man, what am I going to do if my engine dies? I'm just going to fall into the clouds, and who knows what mountain I'll run into. So I flew, and I was getting more and more nervous all the time. And then finally, I saw some lights down to the south, and they were the lights of the Yakima, the city of Yakima. And I think I could also see the rotating beacon at their airport. And so that was a little bit of hope, because I knew at that point I was on the eastern side of the Cascade Mountains. And so that made me feel a whole lot better. By the way, that down there, I was circling around it because I couldn't figure it out, but after I looked at the video closely, I could see that it was a bunch of foam that had been rolled up and somebody dumped it there. And anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so finally I began to get a glimmer of hope, because I had seen Yakima, so I knew I was on the eastern side of the Cascades, so I could expect the weather to begin to clear up. And I flew and I flew, and I kept hearing those crazy sounds that you never hear before. And finally, I began to see down below me, I could start to see some lights now and then as I got to where the clouds were getting thinner. And I kind of knew about where I was, but I had to keep flying east to stay out of the military operation area. And so I flew, and then finally I got to where there were no more clouds, and I could see the ground below with all kinds of lights. And I just kind of guessed that I was past the MOA. And so then I gradually began turning south to go down to the southeastern corner of the state. And one interesting thing that happened, now if you look close here, you'll see there's a whole bunch of little critters that are running around on the ground down there. Just a second, right about in here somewhere is where they show up, I think. And yeah, there goes one right there, and another one over there. And so anyway, there was this huge cloud, and I thought, well, that's, I'll just, when I get to it, I'll fly around it. What I didn't realize was I was already at it. And man, it just got big really fast. And I remember banking the plane to the right and swerving around to go around it. Meanwhile, my kids were in the back seat asleep. And then finally I got close to where it was time to do my pre-landing check, and I had been losing altitude as I was going along. I grabbed my flashlight, because this is an old 1950 plane, and I looked up at my fuel tank indicator on the right side of the plane, and it was empty. With my flashlight, I could see it was empty, and all of a sudden I panicked, and I thought, I forgot to put it on both tanks. And so then I switched to both tanks real quick, and I looked over at the other side where the indicator was, and sure enough, I had enough fuel to make it all the way. So anyway, this is, the return to home button on your on your controller. Well, I had a return to home button in my brain that night. I should never have made that flight. But I got to see the lights of Pasco, and I got to land about 1 in the morning, and took my kids home, and they grew up, and my son is now preparing to have us move out to his place. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I want to thank you for watching, and as always, God bless. One final thought. First of all, I should have gone over my pre-flight checklist, and I would have caught the fact that I didn't have the fuel valve set properly. Secondly, had the right fuel tank ran out of fuel over the mountains, the engine would have quit, and as long as I didn't panic, I would have taken time to switch to the left tank and then give it time to drain fuel down into the engine and pull the starter and get it started again, which during that time I would have drifted or lost altitude. So hopefully I would have been able to not go into the clouds. But the third factor is, when things like that happen, and I'm already nervous because I've heard funny sounds in the engine, I may have panicked, and that would have been the end of it all. So once again, I want to thank you for watching, and God bless.